The very day Ada gave birth, her husband stood at the foot of the hospital bed, looked at their newborn daughter, and said coldly, "That thing is no blessing, she is a curse." Then he walked out and never looked back. But how did it come to this? Let me take you back to where it all began. In the quiet town of Nsukka, under the weight of a struggling marriage and the early morning sun, a woman named Ada fought to keep her family together while carrying a child that would one day change their lives forever. Early morning sunlight crept over the cracked mud walls of a small compound in Nsukka. Ada, 9 months pregnant, balanced a basin of water on her hip as she swept the yard. She hummed a soft Igbo gospel song under her breath for strength, sweat already beading on her brow in the humid dawn. Inside the one-room house, her husband, Raymond, lay sprawled on a thin mattress, one arm over his eyes to block the light. He had no intention of rising to help with the chores. "Mama Emeka, keep it down, I beg," Raymond grumbled from inside, using the nickname that addressed Ada as the mother of their firstborn. Ada paused her humming and sighed, adjusting the heavy basin. It was always like this now. Raymond slept late and rarely lifted a finger, leaving all the responsibilities to her. Their children, 9-year-old Emeka, 7-year-old Amaka, and 5-year-old Obina, moved quietly around their father as they prepared for school. Emeka, already mature beyond his years, took the basin from Ada without being asked. "Let me help, Mama," he said. Ada managed a tired smile, handing it over with relief. Nearby, Amaka helped little Obina buckle his worn sandals. The two younger kids cast weary glances at their father's motionless figure, careful not to disturb him. Raymond did not like being bothered in the mornings. Ada handed each child a small pouch of soaked garri mixed with a bit of sugar, the only breakfast she could afford for their walk to school. "Go well and come back safely, Umwakam, my children," she whispered, kissing each of them on the forehead. The children nodded and filed out, obedient and somber beyond their years. Emeka led his siblings down the dusty path, throwing one last anxious look at his father before closing the rickety wooden door. As the children disappeared, Ada exhaled and leaned against the door frame, one hand cradling her swollen belly. The baby inside kicked as if sensing her worry. A jolt of pain shot through Ada's lower back, stealing her breath for a moment. Labor was close. She could feel it. Fear fluttered in her chest. How would she manage if the baby came today? There was no money saved for a hospital. Raymond hadn't worked in months. Ada's mind flashed back to the day she told Raymond about this pregnancy. Instead of joy, his face had twisted with anger. "Another mouth to feed? Why, Ada?" he had shouted. She remembered how her heart had cracked at those words. To her, every child was a blessing from God. But Raymond saw this unborn baby only as a burden, an added weight to an already struggling family. In the months since, he had grown even more distant and irritable. Some days he barely spoke to her except to complain about the empty cooking pots or the lack of money. Ada bore it silently, finding small ways to earn a few naira by roasting plantains to sell at the roadside when she could. She tried to stretch all the money she had to feed the family. Still, it was never enough. And now, with the baby almost due, Raymond was more distant than ever. That afternoon, Ada's worst fear came true. A wave of sharp pain rippled through her belly, nearly knocking her to her knees. The baby was coming. Ada cried out, and Raymond finally stirred, alarmed by the commotion. Within the hour, with the help of a neighbor and a sputtering taxi, Ada found herself gripping the edges of a thin bed in the local clinic. Her contractions came hard and fast. She sobbed and prayed between clenched teeth as a nurse urged her on. Raymond hovered near the wall, arms folded, anxiety and irritation crossing his face in equal measure. After several excruciating hours, Ada's screams gave way to the piercing cry of a newborn. "It's a girl," the nurse announced joyfully, lifting the squalling infant for the exhausted mother to see. Ada let out a weak laugh of relief and reached out with trembling arms. The nurse laid a tiny baby on Ada's chest. Ada cradled her daughter against her sweaty body, tears of gratitude streaming down her face. In that moment, nothing else mattered. A little girl was here, alive and safe. "Chidimma," she whispered, naming her daughter on the spot. In Igbo, it meant God is good. Despite all the hardship, Ada felt it true. God was still good, blessing her with this child safely. But Raymond's reaction was a stark contrast. "Another girl?" he said flatly from the foot of the bed. Ada looked up at him, her smile fading. She saw disappointment etched on his face. He ran a hand over his mouth and began to pace again. The joy Ada felt wavered under the weight of his scowl. Midwife Chinyere noticed the tension. She busied herself, cleaning up the baby, and then approached Raymond gently. "Mother and baby are fine. We will keep them here for observation for a few hours. Sir, have you brought the delivery fee?" she asked quietly, trying not to upset Ada with the talk of money so soon. Raymond stopped pacing. He glared at the midwife as if her question were an affront. "How much?" he asked tersely. "It's 10,000 naira for everything," Chinyere replied, almost apologetically. She knew Ada's family situation. She had given Ada a discount out of pity. The fee was usually higher. Raymond's eyes widened in anger. 5 what? For what exactly? "All she did was push out a baby," he exploded, throwing his hands up. Ada's arms instinctively tightened around newborn Chidimma as the baby startled at the sudden loud voice. "Please, lower your voice," the midwife chided. "Your wife needs rest." But Raymond was beyond caring. He jabbed a finger in Ada's direction, his face twisted. "I told you we had nothing for this, but you wouldn't listen, eh? Now see what you have done. How do we pay?" Ada felt a stab of humiliation and fear. "Raymond, please," she pleaded weakly. "We will find a way. I can sell." Before she could finish, Raymond cut her off with a harsh laugh. "What will you sell? You have nothing left. We are already in debt because of you and these children." His voice dripped with venom. The midwife gasped, shocked at his outburst. Ada's lip trembled. She had never seen such coldness in her husband's eyes. "This child is a blessing. Don't speak that way," she managed to say, tears foaming. "Blessing?" Raymond echoed, his voice rising in disbelief. He pointed at a tiny infant cradled at Ada's breast. That thing is no blessing. Since you got pregnant, everything went wrong. I lost my job. We have more troubles. She is a curse." The word hung in the air like a foul stench. Ada stared at Raymond, stunned. Even Chinyere was speechless for a moment. Baby Chidimma began to cry again, little wails piercing the tense silence. This child has brought nothing but bad luck. I don't want her. I don't want any of this, he snarled. Ada struggled to sit up, wincing. Pain was still radiating through her body, but the pain in her heart was worse. How? How can you say that? She cried, voice breaking. She's your daughter, Raymond, our blood. Raymond shook his head slowly. I'm done, Ada, he said quietly, a dangerous calm in his voice now. I can't do this anymore. I won't kill myself over all the suffering. You and that baby, you are on your own. With that, he turned on his heel and stomped out of the clinic room, the door swinging shut behind him with a thud. Sir, you can't just leave. Midwife Chinyere hurried after him into the corridor, her voice echoing. Ada could hear her trying to reason with Raymond just outside. At least hold your child. Your wife needs you. But his fading footsteps told Ada all she needed to know. Raymond was gone. Ada let out a wail more anguished than any sound of labor. The nurse hurried back to her side to comfort her. Ada clutched her daughter tightly, sobbing as her world crumbled around her. Her husband had abandoned them, walked out on his family the very day his fourth child was born. Shh, you are okay, love, the nurse soothed, rubbing Ada's shoulder while the infant rooted quietly against her skin. Ada looked down at her daughter's crunched, innocent face. Despite the chaos, the baby had already calmed in her mother's arms. Ada drew a shuddering breath and pressed a tender kiss to the baby's forehead. You are not a curse, my precious girl, she whispered fiercely through her tears. You are a blessing. Gazing at her tiny daughter, Ada felt resolve harden within her. No matter what it takes, she vowed silently, I will care for you. I will care for all of you. Your father may have given up on us, she thought, but I will never abandon my children. The next day, Ada left the clinic with her newborn daughter in her arms and a heavy weight on her shoulders. Word spread quickly through the village that Raymond Okafor had run off, leaving his wife and children. Neighbors shook their heads in disgust or muttered pity, but pity did not put food on the table. Ada returned to the one-room house alone, greeted by the frightened, expectant faces of her other children. Emeka's face searched behind her, hoping to see his father following, but saw only Ada carrying the baby and weeping. Your father is gone, Ada managed to tell them, voice breaking. Gone where? Emeka's face crumpled. I don't know, Ada responded, fighting the tears, itching the corner of her eyes. Amaka covered her face in shock. Little Obina burst into tears. Ada gathered her 3 older children in a tight embrace. It will be all right, she whispered, though she didn't know how. 9-year-old Emeka straightened up, tears still shining in his eyes. He put his small arms around his mother and baby sister as if to bolster them. I'll help you, Mama. I'll take care of us, he promised in a trembling voice. Ada hugged him even tighter. No child should have to shoulder such a burden, but his determination gave her a glimmer of strength. Amaka and Obina pressed close as well, sniffling but nodding as if to echo Emeka's vow. The very next morning, still aching from childbirth, Ada was up at dawn with baby Chidimma tied securely to her back in a cloth. There was no time to rest or heal. Her family needed to eat. She swept the compound, prepared what little food they had, and got the older kids ready for school as best she could. With a newborn in her arms, Ada could no longer trek to the market daily as before. So she set up a small tray in front of their house, roasting plantains to sell to passers-by for some money. Some days she sold nothing at all. The children quickly learned to adapt to their harsh new reality. Emeka hauled water from the public tap every morning and chopped firewood for cooking. He often missed school to watch his baby sister so Ada could work or do odd jobs for neighbors to earn some money. Amaka would rush home after school to cook watery porridge and rock the baby to sleep, while Ada tried to sell at the roadside till dusk. They survived day to day on the thinnest of margins, often eating nothing but garri and salt for supper. At night, when the children were finally asleep, Ada allowed herself to cry silently, face pressed into a thin pillow so no one would hear her despair. The months passed in a haze of exhaustion and worry. Ada's body slowly healed from childbirth, but the daily struggle was unrelenting. She grew thinner, the children's uniforms grew tighter as they stretched up on meals that never seemed enough. But they endured. One evening, about a year after Chidimma's birth, a fierce rainstorm lashed Nsukka. Cold rain leaked through the patched roof, and the kerosene lamp flickered as gusts of wind forced their way through the gaps in the doorframe. Ada had been coughing for days, and that night her fever climbed dangerously high. She lay shivering on the mat, barely conscious, while baby Chidimma, now a chubby 1-year-old, wailed in discomfort beside her, her tiny body burning with fever as well. Emeka knelt between his mother and baby sister, panic pounding in his chest. Amaka and Obinna huddled close, eyes wide with fear as thunder cracked outside. Ada's skin was hot to the touch and she wouldn't fully wake. The baby's cries were growing weaker, which frightened Emeka even more. With no money for a doctor and the roads flooded by the storm, 9-year-old Emeka felt desperation claw at him. He had to do something. Leaving Amaka to dab their mother's face with a damp cloth, Emeka scooped up wailing Chidimma, wrapped her in a cloth, and dashed out into the storm. The night was pitch black and rain pelted his face, but he ran barefoot through mud and puddles, the baby hot and limp in his arms. He banged frantically on Mama Nkechi's door. The old widow opened it, oil lamp in hand, and her eyes widened at the sight of Emeka, soaked and crying, holding a feverish infant. Without a word, she pulled them inside, Emeka sobbing with relief and drenched to the bone, explained in gasps that his mother was very sick and the baby too. Mama Nkechi wasted no time. She bundled Chidimma in a dry wrapper cloth and quickly spooned a herbal tonic into the baby's mouth to bring down the fever. Then, umbrella in hand, she rushed back through the rain with Emeka to Ada's house. All night long, the kindly neighbor stayed by Ada's side. She placed cool compresses on Ada's head and helped the children feed little sips of water to both mother and baby, praying all the while. The hours crept by in terrifying uncertainty. Emeka refused to sleep. He sat by Ada and Chidimma, holding his baby sister's tiny hand and whispering encouragement to his unconscious mother. By dawn, Ada's fever finally broke. Her eyes fluttered open to see her children curled around her and Mama Nkechi grinding fresh herbs for another dose of medicine. Ada was weak and drenched in sweat, but alive. She weakly reached out and squeezed Mama Nkechi's hand, tears of gratitude mixing with the rainwater still dripping from the leaky roof. They had survived the darkest night. After that frightening ordeal, the community railed around Ada's family. Even those who had once judged or gossiped about Raymond's abandonment came forward to help in small ways. The pastor's wife organized a collection at church, raising enough money to cover some unpaid rent and buy bags of gari and rice. Mama Nkechi and a few other women arranged a microloan for Ada, so she could expand a little business. With these funds, Ada built a modest wooden stall by the roadside and began selling roasted plantains, groundnuts, and bean cakes more reliably. It wasn't a fortune, but it meant our children went to bed with food in their bellies more often. Hope crept back into their lives, bit by bit. As the years passed, the Okafor family found a steady rhythm. Ada's children had grown into remarkably resilient young people. Emeka, at 15, apprenticed with a local mechanic after finishing primary school. Each week, he proudly handed Ada a portion of the small stipend he earned patching tires and fixing motorbikes. Hamaka, 13, helped her mother at the stall every afternoon and was quick and sharp with numbers and customers alike. She still dreamed of attending secondary school if they could ever afford the fees. 11-year-old Obina ran errands, swept the stall, and played the clown to lift everyone's spirits on tough days. Poverty still cast its long shadow over them, but the worst had passed. They had each other, and that bond carried them through. It was clear to Ada that her youngest had a special gift. Chidimma, now 6 years old, excelled in school, especially in science. Her teachers often marveled at the little girl's clever mind and inventiveness. For Ada, watching Chidimma thrive was both joyful and bittersweet. She often thought of Raymond's cruel proclamation on the day this child was born and how utterly wrong he had been. Chidimma was no curse. She was the light of their lives, and sooner than expected, she proved it. Fate was not done with the Okafors. When Chidimma was 10, her school science teacher entered her in a statewide science competition. For her project, Chidimma built a simple homemade battery using scrap metal, wires, and a dozen lemons. An experiment she had read about in a library book and then improved with her own ideas. On the day of the competition in Enugu City, the hall was filled with students from all over the state, many of them much older than Chidimma. She was the smallest contestant, standing nervously beside a display table as spectators murmured. Some older students smirked, not expecting much from a little girl in worn shoes. But when it was Chidimma's turn, she stepped forward with quiet confidence. In a clear voice, she explained how she had inserted pieces of copper and zinc into multiple lemons and wired them together in series to create a battery. The judges leaned in with interest. Finally, Chidimma connected her last wire to a small light bulb. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the bulb's filament began to glow. Faintly at first, then shining brightly, powered entirely by a string of lemon batteries. A gasp swept through the audience, followed by roaring applause. The older contestants and judges were astonished that this 10-year-old had achieved what many senior secondary school students could not. Chidimma gave a shy smile as the crowd clapped enthusiastically and her teacher wiped tears of joy from her eyes. It was no surprise when she was announced as the first prize winner. She received the trophy, nearly half her size, and a standing ovation from the entire hall. That victory set off a chain of events Ada could never have imagined. Chidimma's story spread beyond their town. A local news crew came to their compound to interview the little inventor from Nsukka and a proud family. Shortly after, a well-known education foundation in Lagos took notice and offered Chidimma a full scholarship to one of the best secondary schools in the country. And incredibly, they promised to sponsor her attendance at an international science program in the UK when the time came. The scholarship was expansive. It would cover Chidimma's school fees and even assist with the family's relocation and living expenses so that Ada and the other children could accompany her overseas when she went for the program. Ada could hardly believe it when the official letter arrived. In the span of a decade, they had gone from being abandoned with nothing to seeing one of their own celebrated as a young prodigy. It felt like a dream. The day Chidimma received the state scholarship award at her school, there was a big ceremony. Dignitaries, journalists, and local leaders gathered in the dusty school courtyard, which had been decorated with ribbons and banners. Chidimma, shy but beaming, stood on the podium in a neatly pressed school uniform as a commissioner presented her with a shiny plaque and a promise of a bright future. Ada stood just behind her, tears of pride running down her cheeks as she watched her youngest daughter address the crowd. Emeka, Amaka, and Obinna cheered loudly from the front row. After Chidimma gave a short thank you, voice clear as a bell, as she thanked her wonderful mother and siblings for all their support, the headmaster took the microphone. He praised not only Chidimma's brilliance, but also the family's perseverance and unity. As mother and daughter embraced on the podium to cheers, Ada had no idea that far away in Lagos, someone was watching that very news broadcast, someone whose life was about to collide with theirs again, after 10 long years of separation. Raymond, a long-lost husband who had turned his back on them without looking back. Watch out for part 2, coming very shortly. What happens next? You don't want to miss it. Thank you for watching this story. I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Did you learn something from Ada's journey? If this story moved you, please give it a thumbs up to encourage us. Don't forget to share it with someone who needs to hear it. And of course, subscribe and hit the notification bell so you're the first to know when the next part drops right here on the Moral Compass.